Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm Cécile Desjardins. I'm a journalist. I work at L'Opinion. I'm very happy to be with you today for a very interesting topic, public debt, the end of the welfare state. And to talk about this, we have three professionals. It's from Patricia, BARBIZET. She's the president of AFEP, association that brings together the largest French corporations, 2.5 million employees and more the world over. Next to you, Johannes, LINDNER. You're the co-director of Hertie School, a think tank, a specialist in European matters, and working along with the Jacques Delors Institute, Douglas REDIKER. You're non-resident at the Brookings institution, and you will have the look of a banker, of course, an American's point of view here, and our coordinator, Patricia. You are an economic advisor at ICAM and a member of the Cercle des économistes. Patrick, maybe you can set the basis of this round table if you wish. Hello everybody. So we'll start by sort of taking a look at the situation as it is, take stock of the situation, and I will concentrate on the European context, knowing that later we'll talk about the US. In Europe, we have faced with a real issue of the balance of public finances, because we have more than 3 points of GDP of public deficit in the whole of Europe, and chiefly we need a lot of additional public spendings. If we carried out the expenditures and spendings supported by the Draghi report, we'll have 2 to 2.5 points more. You know, these spendings are for the energy transition, digital transition, the financing of innovative projects. If we look at the situation of educational systems in Europe, if you look at the different surveys, PISA and others, the educational system in Europe is a disaster in several countries, and so we really need to increase our spendings for education. And if we look at the health systems, all European countries are aging. They will increase their spendings and be faced with a lot more spendings to cover for dependency costs, and also the military, defense, with the commitment of Europeans to increase by 1.5% GDP their spending. So if you add on all the additional spendings we need to do in Europe, we're probably way beyond 4 or maybe 5 GDP points. And so this gives rise to a lot of problems that we need to address during this conference. First of all, the risk of a debt crisis, the risk that the state can no longer stabilize their debt rate, their public debt rate. The second problem is not discussed often, is the competition in savings. The problem is not only European. In the US, Japan, the Chinese, they do a lot of public spendings. They need to increase their public spending, and there will not be enough savings to finance all these public spending. So there'll be a war to attract this saving. And the third question is, what is the negative aspect associated with having public debt that's too large? If you look at the only negative element, is that an excess of public debt can lead to a reduction of private investments. But if the additional public debt does not lead to an increase of public investment, it's not negative. And we can oppose the US to Europe. The US have a public debt that is very high, and that will increase a lot in the near future. But they also have private investments that are at a very high level, because they have the capacity to attract a lot of world savings, the savings of the world. And Europe not having this capacity, we export our savings to the US. Well, we have a link between high public debt and a reduction of private investment. So it's something that is extremely negative for Europe. Patricia was saying that you're the voice of corporations. So what is your analysis of the situation? What is your take? Well, I share Patricia said, yes, the situation of public finances is difficult and we'll have to react. It's still possible, in my opinion. I'm starting from the point of view of large corporations and the 117 major corporations in France, 2.5 million employments in France, 4.5 in Europe, and 8.5 million in the world over. They're all world leaders in their respective fields. So we're at a crossroad. It's our last chance. Public finance is one element, but it goes beyond that. The situation is evolving. The environment is changing at an incredible pace internationally, in competition also, when it comes to the environment and technology. So all these challenges are really big and we need to face them. So we simultaneously have a transition imperative when it comes to the environment, a digital challenge, a demographic challenge, and we have to make a big effort on defense. So all these challenges are collective and they involve realigning the interests of the states, of private corporations, and of the citizens. So we need to invest, we need to innovate, we need to work intensely, and in France we don't work enough, and France cannot be exonerated and steer clear from the taking of these challenges. But our budgetary situation no longer responds to these needs. We have a tax system and spendings that are very high, it's unstable, there's a defiance of households, and it's additional risk of crisis. And so we have to re-give credibility, stability to public finances. And we need the stability so that the risks can be taken. We need to take risks, and we have to be able to do this in trust. We need investors and households to recover their trust and do their share of the job. And they will do that only if they're reassured. And it's possible. It's possible. I think we can recover this stability. It was done elsewhere in the world. 21 of the 27 EU countries are today under the 3% of public debt, with a public deficit, with having our rate of taxation, and without their social model being radically different than ours. We see that now Germany can use its the margins of maneuver, and this stabilization are, of course, very important assets for that country. In France, it's happened to reduce deficits. It's not the first time that we're faced with this challenge. And from 58 to 65 was more or less the same situation. And we managed. From 75 to 80, yes, we did so. But we know it takes several years to do that. This is not just with a magic wand, but it wasn't during the first or the second period detrimental to the social model. And so we need to reorganize, rearrange in the long term our public actions, and for this we need to rely on the assets of our economy. And from where I speak here as president of AFEP, I can confirm that we have considerable assets through our French corporations and companies. Thank you, Johannes. The difference between the situation of France and other European countries. So how can you describe the European situation, Johannes?
I'm coming from Berlin. I'm not here to lecture the French about debt. But what I will do is speak about where the EU comes in and where the EU can play an important role for the issue of debt in Europe. First of all, I'm less pessimistic on debt. I think on aggregate, the situation in the EU is better than in the US. But there are three important buts. First, the aggregate is the aggregate, but we need to break it down into different groups. And we have clearly three different groups. One, countries that are below 60%, a group of countries that are between 60 and 90%, and a group of countries that are above 90%, France, Greece, Spain, among them. And of course, the problem is more on that group of countries than for those below 60%. Second point is that we face, and I fully agree with the points that have been made, we face enormous spending needs, investment needs. Here, I think the Mario Draghi report has been very clear in terms of the figures that he quotes, 4 to 5% of additional investment GDP that would be coming annually for green transition, for for the digital transition, as well as for defense. Now, we've just had a NATO summit where actually we committed to even more. And the problem is that some of those countries that have committed to more or that will reluctantly signal that they may be doing more are actually in the third group, which of course makes it even more of a huge commitment that they took. Now, my third but is that in a way we are not using the EU optimally. And I want to mention two aspects here. One is fiscal rules. We've just reformed the fiscal rules, and we've used these fiscal rules now for the first time, but we've seen we need to adjust them yet again, but not by reforming them, but by using flexibility in the way we are using them. We are applying them. So we've activated the national escape clause for defense, and we have the issue, it's been mentioned before, that Germany is now spending and it has been reforming its domestic fiscal rules, is spending for infrastructure for defense. But the decision for Berlin to spend is in fact in contradiction to the fiscal rules. And the Commissioner said somehow they will find a way to accommodate Germany. And I think that's a sign where we are trying to sort of fudging the fiscal rules in a way that is not helpful for the credibility. And I think the credibility of the fiscal rules is not to underestimate it, especially in a country like France. Because if you don't have the fiscal rules, you are at the whim of the financial markets. And you don't have that anchor role that fiscal rules have for protecting and shielding in a way the volatility that the financial markets as the main pressure point. Another element where the EU fails, and I think that's a very important one, is on the role of the EU budget. I think there are enormous efficiency gains that we could get from spending things together. We have, I mean, I have the figure here. If we have 178 types of major weaponry in contrast to 30 types in the US. We've just made a commitment to increase our defense spending to 5% by pouring this on national industries rather than really generating the savings to do it together. These are public goods that should be best provided. Now, I said this is where the EU comes in, but I also said that there's an element of kind of suboptimal use of the EU. So I'm not so optimistic that we are quickly going in that direction in terms of a big budget. You know, the budget, even though we've decided to have common issuance for the pandemic, is still way below 2%. And so while I think this would be a good route, especially when we do common issuance, further common issuance also with the idea of creating a common safe asset, I'm not so optimistic that we go that route very quickly.
Vous êtes un vrai Européen, Johannes, c'est impressionnant.
For a genuine European, Johannes, it's impressive. I'd like to go back on what I was saying, and excuse me for the cliche role I'm giving to you, but what is the situation today in the US? And when Johannes says that we can change the rules, can you hear me? Okay, but, okay.
Question.
The question is, what is your opinion of the situation in the U.S. that prevails in the U.S.? And I like your reaction. You know, Johannes says that we have a tendency of changing the rules in Europe. Is that the same on the other side of the U.S.? How does it? What happens when you change the rules in the U.S.?
Again, apologies for that. So I'd like to answer that in the context of starting off with two observations. One, global public debt, and then switching to the U.S., where today is an auspicious day because it appears that the U.S. is about to increase its deficit by between $4 and $5 trillion. And I always caution when I say $1 trillion, whether it's in English or whether it's translated, the more useful way to think about that is every $1 trillion or trillion euros is 1,000 billion dollars or euros, and that sort of is a good way to framing the scale of what we're talking about. But in terms of globally, in 2007, global public debt to GDP was between 35 and 40%. Now it's less than 20 years later, and it is more than 100%. And I think that's pretty striking. I think that's just a reflection that the world is addicted to debt. And so that raises the question, who do you blame? Is it the addict or the supplier? And lenders, the banks and the capital markets, the private investors, the savings that were referred to earlier, they used to ask questions of countries that borrowed, and they said, are you going to be able to repay? And then they started asking questions, are you going to be able to refinance? And then they just stopped asking questions. And I think that's where we are today. The question is whether, in the context of these exploding debts, whether the providers of capital are going to start asking questions again. And that takes me to the US, where today it appears that the US is going to pass what is called the One Big Beautiful Bill, which is a 10-year budget for the US, which will increase the budget deficit of the US by $3.3 trillion, or as I said earlier, $3,300 billion. And that's the reality. Now, here's where we get to the magic wand that Patricia was mentioning. We don't have a magic wand. Well, apparently we do, because in the US, they have used a legislative trick, a magic trick, where they've decided to use an obscure provision that allows them to ignore $4 trillion of debt and make it magically appear to be $500 billion of deficit reduction. This is all accounting paperwork, but it's what worries me the most is everyone knows this. This is not masking behind the curtain. This is public knowledge. But the providers of capital, the providers of that public debt, know it, and what we use a phrase in the US, bond vigilantes. That's supposed to mean the providers of public debt that force governments to act responsibly. They've decided to go to sleep. And they're ignoring this and allowing everyone to get away with it as the budget deficits explode, the national debt explodes, global public debt explodes. And in the US context, the problem is this: you can make a case that if you explode public debt and borrowing, but you're providing the welfare state, the public good, that you're making a choice. But in the current budget that's being approved in the US, it's actually cutting benefits for the majority of the people who need it most, while raising the debt, raising deficits to pay for tax cuts. And it's a very unsustainable situation. And the question I raise is, when are the public markets and the banks and the providers of capital going to react?
Et vous avez déjà donné plusieurs pistes, mais j'aimerais...
You gave several paths, but what are the possible solutions in your opinion? Patricia, well, you just raise taxes. Is that what you do?
Tu veux faire des 20 minutes? Not at all. It's a significant challenge, so it will be long. So we shouldn't underestimate the number of years it takes to change the system. But we need to start now, and for good. And what does it mean to start for good? To restore a climate based on trust and confidence for all the companies and businesses. They will invest if they feel that they can invest in the long term, and they will be able to get some stable conditions for investment. There should be a simple and legible framework. Rules shouldn't change every 10 minutes. We shouldn't invent new rules. We need to stabilize public finance, and we need to free up business activities. It has been done. It was done in 2017, and it worked well. Some actions were launched. So clearly, we should stop increasing taxes, and we need to cap spending. And above all, and this is my last point regarding the short term, and there are some wrong solutions. We should avoid them. If we increase taxes now, We take everything now and then we will put a strain on the future, and in the end it doesn't work. You don't have neither growth nor investments, and you are not in a good position. We need to work more. We need to start now. We need to produce more. We work less, we produce less than our neighbors. And we need to free up activity, business activities. We need to foster the reforms in terms of apprenticeship. We need to pursue the pension reform. We need to support research. That's pivotal. If companies don't have a research center in France, they won't invest in plants and they won't make the production centers. We need to give clear signals to the companies and businesses. We need to produce and innovate in France. And the last point, something that has been already highlighted, we need to implement the great reports that have been drafted, the Leta report, the Draghi report, the Noir report. We've got the instructions for use in terms of investments and instructions for use regarding the money that can be tapped. So you were reacting after Doug, and you are nodding in approval regarding the implementation of the reports. What are the short-term solutions?
In terms of implementing Mario Draghi and Enrico Letta's report, and in fact Enrico is here also tomorrow to make another pitch for his report. And I think what is important is that it is really widening the cake that we want to distribute in a way by boosting growth opportunities, and at the same time by mobilizing private capital for addressing some of the investment needs. Because if we don't have the public money, we need to mobilize more the private money. And I think for both, Europe is not the exclusive solution, but can be part of that solution. I mean, I find it striking if you look at how we are really having high opportunity costs for not doing Europe. And there are nice figures by the IMF that says that the equivalent of our current barriers in terms of national fragmentation is similarly for goods to a tariff of 45%. And for services, it's similar to a tariff of 110%. So if we get rid of these fragmentations between us, and I mean, France is exporting 60 to 65% to its neighbors. So if we get rid of this, we would really boost the economy. But let's make a second point also in terms of single market, and that's the capital markets and the possibilities to finance the investment needs through a single market for capital markets, capital, what's called the Saving and Investment Union. And it has two objectives in a way. On the one hand, it tries to mobilize the capital, as I said already, but it also puts the finger to something that we have here in Europe that is something that we need to address. That is that we are high in savings, we have high saving rates, 15% versus 8% in the US. But in fact, we'll put our money into cash or deposit accounts where it's actually not yielding a lot of returns. And at the same time, we would need to mobilize that savings for the investment. So in that respect, the notion of a saving investment union is to say, how could we also free us in a way from the barriers, from some of the national regulation that hold us back, and how can we bring and create sort of bigger players that accumulate these savings and offer better returns. Now, link it back, let me just do that one point, link it back to the title, namely La fin d'État-providence, end of the welfare state. There's one interesting connex between what I've just said about saving and investment union and welfare state reform. And it may not sound particularly enchanting to French ears. It doesn't do very enchanting reactions in Germany either. But if we look at Sweden, if we look at Denmark, if we look at the Netherlands, how they reformed their pension systems and created pension reforms and pension funds, they have created a player that is investing in scale-ups, in startups, and actually have solved one big problem, namely the viability of their pension systems.
Alors justement, vous avez donné la mèche. J'allais demander à Patrick Artus.
So Patrick Artus, can you tell me there are some countries who've managed, we know that it's Sweden. Sweden has won the prize. Of course, we shouldn't make a comparison between Europe and the United States. The United States, they have a more dynamic economy. They invest more in research and development in corporate companies. The technological sector is bigger, but social protection is very low, very weak, a lot of poverty, lots of inequalities. And this is not acceptable in Europe. So I think that it's important to look at countries in Europe with dynamic economies, and at the same time they manage to keep a quality social protection system. As Johannes said, we need to look at Finland regarding the quality of the education system. Finland is the only European country, according to the PISA surveys, is on a par with Asian countries, and we know exactly what Finland did. So a collective education, all types of children are mixed up. I mean, children in a bad patch, children who are doing well. Let's look at the Netherlands for the pension system. The pension system is huge. And in fact, they can invest in new companies, in development companies. We need to look to Sweden. Sweden at the end of the 1990s. Of course, at that time there was a significant financial crisis, and Sweden undertook loads of reforms that were collectively accepted by the Social Democrats, by the Conservatives. Lots of Swedes accepted those reforms. These reforms made it possible to create a pension system. It was done in other Nordic countries, but these reforms changed the structure of a state. The Swedish state is like a combination of agencies tasked with one of the functions of a state. And these agencies, in these agencies, you have some employees with a private status. There aren't too many civil servants in Sweden, and they are assessed on a regular basis. And in a matter of a few years, in 6-7 years, with the system, the weight of public spending has dropped by 20 points. Of course, with a caveat that I will mention later. And I can tell you that the quality of the public sector has been beefed up in education, environment, and in all of the public sector related topics. But there's a caveat, as I said. The Swedes privatized non-essential functions. So if you strike a balance between the public good and the budget savings following a better organization of a state, it means that public spending has been reduced by 10%. And the public sector hasn't deteriorated even further. Denmark, Finland, if you look at the research and development level, it is very high, very nice companies. These small companies have global companies. And at the same time, there's an essential element of this model. They stopped protecting employment. In France, in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, employment, job protection is a taboo, and they started to protect people. For example, in Denmark, when you lose your job, you will get a new job in less than 4 months, a new job that is better paid in a more dynamic sector of the economy. You will be covered by the unemployment benefits to the tune of 80%, and you'll be able to refresh your expertise. So I can tell you that you don't have a lot of mobility between sectors, so nothing to do with Schumpeter, and I can tell you that this system is very good. So Duke, as Patrick pointed out, we are not going to compare Europe and the United States, but two solutions, according to you, that are relevant in order to sort out this impossible equation. What is your take on that?
First, picking up on Johannes's reference to Capital Markets Union, I was a banker in Europe 25 years ago when I was putting pitch books together in anticipation of the imminent adoption of Capital Markets Union. That was in the early 2000s. It is now 2025, and we are effectively no closer. So I completely embrace that idea, but pardon me for being a little bit skeptical, only because I've got 20+ years of hearing the promises and not seeing the actual conclusions come to bear. But I want to focus on the US, because I think actually the solutions are shockingly obvious. That doesn't mean they're easy to implement, but the US has an entitlement problem. The US has 49% of its mandatory budget that goes, or its overall budget goes to Medicare, Social Security, and defense. Of the mandatory budget spending in the United States, 80% of that spending goes to those 3 programs. If those are taken off the table, then you cannot solve the unsustainable path the US is on. I'm just talking about the US here, but I do think that so-called entitlement reform is a necessary component of anything. It is not a question of just stimulating private sector investment, which I completely believe in. It's not just rationalizing public sector workers, which I completely believe in. But we have to understand that, at least in the US context, these programs were created in anticipation that most of the people entitled to them would never be alive to collect a single dollar. They now have 20 or 30 years of expectations. And if you do not ratchet those back to a more reasonable trajectory, the US at least is on an unsustainable path, no matter what it does on any of the other measures.
Patricia, vous vouliez réagir tout à l'heure, alors
Patricia, you wanted to react. The way we can change things and what can we do? There are lots of semantic debates about the word reform. We need to modernize. We need to modernize the system. We need to modernize the public good. We need to modernize the way we relate to work, and we need to modernize our economy. And if we start with that rationale, we will get some good assets to tap. Public power should be modernized. We need to use digital technologies. We need to forge public-private partnerships in great numbers. And the state should focus on what he can do and what he should do and what it could do. The state can't do everything. So there should be a better link between the private sector and the public sector. We need to modernize our economy. We need to modernize our social model. We need to work more. Everybody knows that. Everybody's ready. We need to work more. So we work less than our neighboring countries. We need to encourage and boost education, training. We need to make sure that people are proud when they work. And we tend to pit work against the economy. It is neither one nor the other. Labor issues shouldn't be politicized. So I think that we could achieve that objective with some good reforms. We've got all the assets. So there will be a Q&A session in a few minutes. Are you optimistic, pessimistic about the future? What is your take on that, Patrick, Patricia? I'm optimistic and realistic, but of course we need to do it. We need to turn words into deeds, and we need to be positive. French people know how to do that. We're able to launch big projects, successful projects. This is the kind of philosophy that we need to enforce, and we need to move ahead without talking too much. Where do we come from? We don't agree. But what is important is to look at the trajectory, and I think that everybody is ready to achieve that goal if we focus on efficiency, on growth, on dynamism, on education. All the main issues are really important to the different people in the long term. Pessimist or optimistic? I'm pessimistic, really pessimistic. Johannes is right. Europe won't be able to modernize if Europe doesn't keep their savings, and they send 400 billion euros to the US in order to modernize the EU the capital union, the savings union, is one of the few elements of the problem. Investing in the US will yield more than investing in Europe. First point. Second point. So you need to consider the educational system in all European countries. In the four major European countries, the education systems are very weak, and lots of problems, psychological problems for children. The teaching levels are not good. The teachers are not well paid. So, third point, why am I pessimistic? There is no political consensus. Maybe I'm too biased, but there is no political consensus in order to embark upon a Swedish type of reform. It would be very relevant. In Sweden, this reform had been discussed with the political parties, with the social partners. We convinced all of the political parties and the social partners. They were convinced that these were efficient reforms, which is not the case in France. In France, it will be very difficult to get a consensus regarding an in-depth reform of a state, and as long as the state doesn't reform itself, we won't be able to get extra money in order to invest in the activities of the future. Doug, pessimistic, optimistic?
Optimistic that technology, AI, and others are actually going to contribute enormously to productivity gains, and that those productivity gains are going to be a real stimulus to the economy. But I'm pessimistic that governments are ever going to get their acts together to avoid using magical thinking in trying to address some of these. So to some degree, the optimism I expressed about the growth and productivity gains in the technology arena actually make me more pessimistic that governments will feel the pressure that they need to, because they'll be able to project, as the US does right now in this magical bill that's being passed as we speak, in projecting growth that is just artificially stimulated and increased on the back of this ethereal, magical AI bubble that is going to suddenly create growth out of nothing. The current Council of Economic Advisors in the US projects that the US will decline its debt to GDP by 3% this fiscal year. In order to do that, on the back of its growth assumptions, the US would have to grow 10% in the next 3 months. Let's just say that's an unrealistic, magical expectation. So if Europe is now committed, Europe NATO members, to 5% of NATO spending, I think that's necessary under the context of where those commitments were made. I just don't understand how, but for magical accounting tricks, they're going to actually be able to find that spending without making very serious compromises elsewhere. So I'm pessimistic that the reality is going to be able to be dealt with by politicians.
Johannes, je vous ai gardé pour la fin, pas par hasard. Remontez-nous le moral.
Please pick up our more optimistic or pessimistic. Optimistic for two reasons. Well, one,
I think much of what we discussed has a national dimension. These are national choices. And I'm not saying a national social contract, that Europe is the solution to everything. But I would say we are in a situation where we don't have the luxury not to do Europe. And on that, I think I'm a bit more optimistic. First, I think we really have the call for more autonomy as Europe now. We really now see what's the alternative. What's us? What are the value that unites us? And what's the others? And I think that can be a uniting force. Secondly, I think citizens, if you look at some of the polling, people want solutions. They want solution capacity. And I think, and I hope, that articulates in itself, not as a way of politicians say, oh, I can't do, I need to go back to the national solutions, but actually that encourages them to go ahead. And then thirdly, coming from Berlin, I do sense a bit that the new German government at least wants to try, that Klingbeil and Merz want to take a more sort of leadership role. But I think it only works if they get a lot of pressure from the other member states and from the constituency in Germany that they're actually living up to their aspirations.
C'est chouette de savoir qu'il y a des pays qui essayent, qui veulent y arriver.
I like to hear that some countries try and they want to be on the winning side. Are there any other questions? Normally you have to wait for the microphones. Before you ask your questions, yes, we have a question. We have a microphone in the room. There's a question at the third row and also in the back of the room. Few minutes. Good morning. Good afternoon. I have a question on the financing of the welfare state. I'd like to have your opinion on Antoine Fouché's proposal. He was with Muriel Pénicaud, the Labor Ministry. When we discussed that these social costs are too expensive, and they proposed that 100 billion be transferred to the VAT, social VAT. And is this proposal, could it really have the beneficial effect, increase the competitiveness of companies, because there will be lower taxes and social costs, and it would improve the workers' buying power because there would be a better redistribution, or is it a false good idea? Patrick, you're the expert on that. Yeah, we know the proposal, Antoine Fouché's proposals. There are two possibilities here. It's true that we talk about France, but France has an exaggerated way of financing its social benefits based on wages, on taxing the wages. The opposed example is Denmark, where you have no social taxes. Everything is financed by direct taxes. So Antoine Fouché's proposal is to lower the social costs of workers and replace it by VAT or what have you, or just increasing income taxes. So it's a way of increasing buying power and encouraging work. There's another proposal by MEDEF is to lower the social costs of corporations and to finance that by a tax of some sort. Then you improve profitability, incentives to invest. And I'm in favor, because I think there are some social spendings like family spendings which benefit to all, that are financed only through taxing wages, and that's not reasonable. There's a question at the fourth row, and I'm director of a company, the key figure in our country. Don't you think it's the share of the French who live directly or indirectly from the state, who depend on the state for their livelihood? Johannes, or who would like to answer this? Well, I think that we should lower the labor costs, increase everybody's competitiveness, and finance social protection through growth. Yeah. So we have 55 to 56% of the French people who live directly or indirectly from the state. We, as corporate leaders, how can corporate leaders interfere on a public debt that is out of their reach? No, on the lowering of social costs and competitiveness and more activity. Maybe another question. The comparison is in English-speaking countries. In Sweden, we're not Anglo-Saxon countries. But there's the employment rate. We haven't talked about the employment rate. In Germany, for example, it's 10 points higher than in France. When we say that France produces little, it's not a question of length of working days. It's the proportion. It's a question of the proportion of the population that has a job, and it's the employment rate that is at stake here. So the best way of establishing a new balance in the social protection system is increasing the employment rate. If we had the employment rate of Germany, we would have a tax pressure that is absolutely the same as in Germany. When we say that taxes are too high in France, they're too high compared to tax incomes that are too low. If we had a higher employment rate, there wouldn't be such a problem in France. Yes, thank you. My name is Jean Barry, and I'd like to ask you the following question. Do you think that the adopting a pluriannual financial scheme like we have in Europe, it will enable to have a better management of resources in France and better analysis of costs and their the public impact? pluriannual budget. Yes, I think a bit of planning and not making changes every day, whether as far as the income and spendings, we would have a better stability, and we would be able to invest. It would strengthen the model. It's one of the components, and yes, it would contribute to be with planning.
And allow me to make this point, because you rightly say that in Europe we have this multi-annual financial framework, and in fact we moved from 5 years to 7 years. But in Europe, actually, we've gone too far. We have a rigid corset on how we spend that really takes out a lot of agility. It helps us because we have these big budget battles only every 7 years, so we reduce the conflict. But the expense for this is that we are very reactive, very inagile. So in my view, we actually, for the new financial framework, for the new negotiations, we have to really think about reducing the length potentially, but at least to increase the flexibility, because we've seen that Europe has lost that agility to react to common crisis. And in that respect, we've been lucky that the pandemic was at a time when we just were renegotiating the MFF. But we were lucky. So I think we need a much more flexible MFF than what we have now. But we come from a very rigid endpoint.
On peut prendre une dernière question si la question est rapide.
One last question, if it's quick. Madam? Yes, good afternoon. I'd like to send face-to-face Mrs. BARBIZET and Monsieur ARTUS on the length of the working week. I agree with Mrs. BARBIZET. We should prolong the work day. I'm 55 and I'm ready to work as much as I can, but companies, when the employees are a certain age, they terminate them because they're too old and too expensive. And I agree with you. Well, the state shouldn't take care of things it doesn't know how to take care of. But besides the temporary contracts for senior citizens, what's important here is the people who have a job. It's to stay at work as long as possible, but we're not, people don't let us do that. I'm not sure I see how we can manage this. Well, there's a big movement in large corporations to take this question into account and favor the employment of senior employees, to companies to adapt the paths and the circuits. You know, I think there's a new awareness. There's more effort where we should work less during week, less number of years during a lifetime, and this awareness is strong. And in large corporations, a lot of measures are being proposed to accompany this movement. Patrick, very briefly, I think you agree. Yeah, if we look at the employment rate in France, it's lower than in the other European countries. One, for the youth, there's a problem of the educational systems. Second, for the low-skilled employees, the problem of vocational training, which is oriented towards skilled workers already. And the third is the over 60s. And it's the problem of the difficulty of keeping a job. Not only the legal age of retiring, it's the problem where people are terminated at a certain age. And you know that in companies, there's practically no vocational training for people over 50. So we really have to give some thought on that, changing the modalities of access to vocational training. Well, we have to conclude, otherwise we'll be kicked out of this room. As a conclusion, if I propose an action, a hope, something you would like to be implemented that could fix things, in 30 seconds each, Doug, what would you say? In a nutshell.
Mike.
I've got a hope and I've got an action. The hope is that Europe gets over its aversion to common euro-denominated issuance. The IMF wrote a paper several years ago finding that Europe could issue 2 trillion euros worth of common debt and it would not would not raise anyone's borrowing costs. I think that would be an enormous wish that Europe would get there. And my action would be that every school kid is taught, mandatory, to read the Draghi report and the Letter report, so that when they grow up, they actually know why they inherited what they inherited.
Johannes, une action, un vœu?
I fully agree with Doug. Reading of the Draghi and the letter reports, absolutely. But if I could end, and I'm from the Jacques Delors Centre in Berlin, so allow me to make my wish in a connection with Jacques Delors. Jacques Delors' birthday, 100th birthday, is on the 20th of July in less than 3 weeks. And I would hope that politicians on that day think a bit about the courage that he and his generation of politicians had at the time, because they overcame Eurosclerosis and they created the union that we have today.
Patricia.
Mon vœu, ce serait qu'on fasse.
My wish would be that we do what we say we're going to do. We are aware of everything. We know the situation. Now we have to do things. We have to move, implement. And it will work if we decide to do things with the same determination that was supported by the French and Europeans in the difficult moments that we mentioned earlier, where plans were set up, and either with Jean Monnet or Raymond Barre or others. So we know, we've taken stock of the situation, and we saw that in all circumstances in France, I'm sure it's true in Europe, in all difficult moments, it was true with COVID and other situations, people can take their responsibility and act positively. The stakes are considerable, challenges are high, we have the diagnosis, now we have to move, and my wish is that it works. Patrick Artus, and the concluding words. Well, my hope, my wish is that we take care of the youth. We have a difficult situation with all the educational systems, even in Germany now, that will take us to very difficult times for a lot of youth when it comes to joining the labor market. So the first priority is to straighten out the capacity of educational system to train youth in a good way and enable them to access jobs. Okay. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, the four of you, and right on time for the next session. Thank you.